listeners, it's Jana. Welcome to 2025. Did you know that this month marks 10 years of Grief Out Loud being on the airwaves? There are a few ways you can help us celebrate. First, be sure you're subscribed or following us in Apple Podcasts or on Spotify. Second, you can leave us a rating and a review on either platform. And third, you could send me an email at griefoutloud@dougie.org and let me know what the show means to you. It's hard to believe that we've been sharing these raw, open, and meaningful conversations about grief for a decade, and we're grateful to each guest and each listener who helped make the show what it is today. Grief is a classic both-and experience. It's universal, but it's also deeply personal. It can break us down, but it can also help us find pockets of strength and wherewithal we never imagined that we could have. Joining us today is someone who knows the both-and of grief all too well, Lauren Sisler. Lauren's a former collegiate gymnast, an award-winning sports broadcaster, an ESPN sideline reporter, a motivational speaker, and the author of the inspiring book, Shatterproof. When she was a freshman in college, both of Lauren's parents died, hours apart, from prescription drug use. In this episode, Lauren shares about the shame, grief, and fear that led her to keep the truth about her parents and their deaths a secret. In writing Shatterproof, Lauren decided to be honest about what happened, and in doing so, found a way to own and love her story. Lauren, thanks for making time to be on Grief Out Loud, especially during a super busy football season for you.
Woo, it's busy, Jana. Let me tell you, I am rocking and rolling over here, flying in and out of all these different cities. And, it's funny. I never really know exactly where I'm going until like 4 or 5 days before. So it's an adventure to say the least.
How would high school Lauren have described her parents?
I love this question so much. Kind of going into some deep thought about this. Loving. And when I say loving, it's that unconditional love. They were always the parents that literally just like lifted us up in our successes, applauded us, but also like were that safety net, that blanket, when disappointment would come our way. And I say me and my brother, Alan, he's older than me, 2.5 years older, is, just two people that were so involved in everything we did, so rooted in everything we did. I was an athlete, I was a gymnast, and it was just, they were so present. And I remember them walking into the gym and they'd watch my routines, they'd watch me practice and then go to all my competitions. And when I replay back the VHS tapes of me competing back in the day, I would always just, hear just the loud screams, the cheering from my mom and the cheering from my dad and that loud whistle, and just two people that showed so much support and gave so much love. And, we were extremely close, tight-knit family. And when I think about the high school days, that's kind of when, look, I'm a girl, everyone says it, you turn into the brat, right? And for me, I think there was a little bit of a brat Lauren in there. For sure there was. Wasn't always obeying, got in little scuffles with my mom and would talk back. And then I would just feel like, I can't go to school. I can't go to gymnastics practice being upset with my mom. And it was just this thing that always weighed on my heart, that I always wanted to maintain that strong, close relationship with my parents. And so even to the day that I left for college, Jana, my parents would tuck me in at night. We would say our prayers. And, it was just one of those things that was so important to me to just have that moment, that bonding moment. And so while some teenagers tend to run away from mom and dad, I felt like I was just leaning in and I was getting closer and closer to them just as I continued to grow and get older.
Two things that really stood out to me as I was reading and listening to your book, Shatterproof, about the relationship you had with your parents was that your mom was the first one you'd always want to call when you were working out a new, I don't know what you call it, a move, a thing?
Gymnastics move, skill combination. Yeah.
And that she was the one that you wanted to call. Like she immediately was like, Mom, I got to tell you about this thing. I figured it out or I'm working on it. And then when you went to college and you and your parents set up a schedule where all three of you could be on the phone at the same time, I just really feel like that highlighted the closeness of the three of you as a unit in that way.
Yeah. My mom was the one that knew all the technical stuff about gymnastics. My dad, like, he struggled to get it right. You hear him in the commentary and the videos, and he'd be screaming like, "Way to go, Lauren!" And he'd be like, "Okay, Lauren's getting ready for the bars," and meanwhile, I'd be like getting ready for the balance beam, and it's like, Dad, like, come on, you got to get this right. But my mom was just so much more technical, and I think she just kind of thrived in that, the almost being a judge herself, being able to like pinpoint deductions and where things were. And it was never suffocating though. And I will say that because you do see parents when it comes to athletics and sports, and me as a former athlete kind of see this too, is like parents that would just suffocate their kids, right? With like the deductions and the perfection. And you've got to get this if you want to get this. And how do you operate within the confines of that? And I will say, my parents pushed me. Don't get me wrong. They pushed me. And there were times where, there was frustration. Like I wasn't going for a skill. I wasn't performing well in gym. And I think my parents felt that. But that, I think that's all part of being a parent. And that's something I'm learning. I have a 15-month-old, and I'm still far from maybe learning that from the competitive standpoint with my little man Mason. But, as a parent, you want to see your kids succeed. You want to see them grow and thrive and have success, because I do think that my success allowed them to celebrate, and my, sadness, and when I would face challenges and setbacks and injuries, I think it hurt them deeply because they had to watch me go through that. And, you are an extension of your parents.
So how have the descriptions and the way you talk about your parents changed for you in the past 2 decades since they died?
Ooh, that's so good. It's crazy to me because I would say, obviously early on, I went into protection mode, protecting how they died, protecting why they died, protecting the shame that was associated with the fact that they died of overdose. And that was something that I tried to protect for so many years. So, I still talk to them. I talked about them very largely, very big. And that was how I operated. But there was this kind of sense inside of me that I wasn't sharing the truth. And even though I was sharing the truth about who they were as people, I was running from something. I was running from that thing that was creating that sort of anxiety, that shame, that stuffiness inside me. And, being an honest person that I am, I just, started kind of telling these fabricated lies to kind of hide that. And so I think early on, I really started to feel the weight of that, maybe subconsciously. But as time has progressed and as I've started to own their story and own my story, I have I have honestly felt this love for my parents that I didn't possibly think that I could feel in their absence. And I think that's what's so crazy about all this is that, I'm going through this process. I'm grieving them. I'm going through the shame, anger. Like, why did this happen to me? Why did this happen to my parents? And then just some anger of like, why did they allow this to happen? Why did they not tell us? Why did they become addicts? Why did they go down this dark road and just keep it such a secret from us? Right? So you're sitting here thinking, mm. So it's these stages, but I get here to, I'm coming up on almost 22 years in March that they will have been gone. And, my love for them, I thought my love for them was obviously very strong while they were here, but it has only continued to grow in their absence. And I truly believe that a lot of that probably comes from just, using their story to help provide hope for other people, to help people navigate challenges, navigate shame, navigate the issues that we're all faced with in life. And just to be open and vulnerable, I think it's because I get this opportunity to talk about them and talk about them in a loving way, but also like get rid of the sugarcoating. Like we're done with that. And I think that you obviously, as you mentioned, reading through my book, I was the queen of sugarcoating everything. Like I literally have this vision of myself like a cartoon character with one of those dang like sifters, with sugar in it. Powdered sugar, because I was the girl that always wanted extra powdered sugar on my funnel cake. So I laugh about it, but I was like the girl that's over here just sprinkling the sugar on everything because I wanted everybody to think life was great and my family is great and we are great. And that was the competitive nature in me. I also just think that was the upbringing, that we put on this facade that life is good. We're going to get through this. We're a family. We're together. But then when I started undoing all that and quit sprinkling sugar on everything, it's amazing how my love for them in their best moments and even in the worst moments has continued to grow.
Two things really stood out to me as you were saying that, Lauren, is that even though when you were young, you didn't know your parents were struggling with substances and there was some element of them hiding that from you and from the world, you sort of inherited this mode of hiding certain things from the world, even though it wasn't like communicated to you directly. And then the second thing that stood out is that, as we shut down parts of our story and shut down the parts of other people's stories, we shut down our ability to stay fully connected to them. And as you stop shutting down their story, stop shutting down your story, suddenly there's more access to the fullness of your parents and to the fullness of yourself.
Oh, I love that. That is so good. And that speaks to that so much because I have been sitting here as I've been navigating this journey, now becoming a mom myself and experiencing that and, writing a book and digging under, peeling back all the layers. It's like discovery mode. I think you're right in that it's so easy to cut people off. It's so easy to when you have that anger and when you're experiencing that grief and you're experiencing those different emotions, it's easy to kind of push those things out. And then, like you said, you eventually just become disconnected. And I think that had I have continued on that path, continued to share that story and never really truly fully embraced what happened to my parents and how it happened and why it happened, had I have not taken these steps, I believe everything you're saying there, that my connection with them would be probably non-existent. And it would just sort of be like that was the past life. And now I've lived my life longer without them than I have with them. I think it's so important to me, Jana, too, as I am now becoming a mother myself, is I want my son to have a connection with them. And while it won't be in the physical, I want him to feel connected emotionally and spiritually and in a way that he knows my parents through me and how I live my life and how I parent him. And some of those parenting things will be very similar to my parents, but there's things that they did. My parents were far from perfect. I'm far from perfect. There are things that I recognize now, knowing what I know, being more mature, that I want to be able to navigate, use as maybe a lesson in how I'm going to parent my son and maybe do things differently than how my parents did.
Well, let's help listeners catch up a little bit with your story because you know your story and I read your book, so I know your story. But let's take it back to when you were a freshman in college. You're 18. It's 2003. Both of your parents die. What did you understand at that point about what happened?
Yeah, so I'm at Rutgers studying courses for pre-med, wanted to be a sports doctor as an athlete myself. I felt like that was a good fit, get the athletes back out on the field of play, wanted to be part of that, and get a phone call from my dad to let me know my mom died. And it came as a complete shock. Had just talked to my mom on the phone hours before, talked to my dad, said, I love you, said goodbye. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Mom's 45 years old. Dad, what happened? And he says, Lauren, get on the next plane you can, and I'll be at the airport to pick you up. And he never did show up that day. And two, passed away. And at that time, as that news was delivered to me, it was my uncle and my cousin who instead came to the airport to pick me up and had to deliver the news that my dad had also passed away. In that moment, it was just a complete shock. And of course, you're wondering why and what happened, but also you're just trying to process like this significant loss. While you want to know why, you're also just sitting there trying to process the moment of being there. And so, it would be months before we as a family would find out actually what took their lives because they have to do the investigation, the toxicology reports to discover all these things. But I personally never had conversations with anybody that was there that day. The sheriff, the deputies, everybody that showed up, the rescue squad, the people that were there when this chain of events happened. So I never had the opportunity to really dig under the surface. And it's wild because when I think back to it, like, I was never really on the front lines of the story. I was kind of in the background in many ways, yet I'm the leading role, right? Myself and my brother, like the ones inheriting this tragedy. Yet I think what happens is, my family goes into recon mode, right? It's like, we got to protect Lauren. We got to protect Alan. We got to get them back to school. My brother was in the Navy. We got to help everybody kind of pick up the pieces. And I think my auntie Linda, my uncle Mike, my auntie Linda is my mom's sister, did a really good job of of just that, of quickly helping us pick up the pieces and wasting no time and trying to help us heal from this situation. But I think in that essence too, it's like you don't quite feel the gravity of it. And you're just sort of, okay, next thing, next thing, next thing, next thing. You're kind of just being herded along to get to the next phase. And so I think in a lot of ways, and I praise my aunt and uncle for just the work that they did to get me to where I am, because they really kind of just sort of a little bit of tough love, got to keep pushing, got to keep going, got to keep going. And I think that enforced me, going back to Rutgers, staying on the gymnastics team, making better grades, trying to do all the things that I was failing at miserably because of what I had experienced. But it took several months to even know like how my parents died. But the crazy thing is like my aunt literally and I drive to the coroner's office to pick up the toxicology reports and the investigation, and it's in a manila envelope. And literally she walks out to the car after she had thumbed through it and said, "Hey, do you want to read this?" I said, "No," threw it in the floorboard and never looked back until 10 years. 10 years was the first time that I ever ripped that thing open and looked at what was inside. And I just ran from it because I knew deep down something was wrong. I knew deep down something was amiss. I knew my parents were taking medication. I knew they were going to a pain management doctor. But when you see pill bottles stacked up in the cabinet with their names on it, you think that's prescribed to them. That's normal. There's nothing off about this. I'm just doing life, getting through life, doing what I got to do, not recognizing right in front of me my parents' lives were unraveling and that they were becoming heavily addicted to the opioid drugs they were prescribed for their chronic pain. It was about a 3 to 4 year descent into this addiction. I couldn't see it. They did such a good job of hiding it. And I think too, being young and naive, I did a good job of running from it.
What do you remember about that time 10 years later when you did open the envelope and read the report from the coroner?
Oh, so I had been working at CBS 42 here in Birmingham, Alabama, which is currently where I live now. At this point, I had decided that I was ready to kind of face the truth. And the reason for that is because I started seeing all these headlines were popping up, because at the time when my parents passed away, pain management was very new. Things were still very new. Ignored it for so many years. And then as I started to grow and mature, really it was kind of this like shift at about the 7-year mark when my auntie Linda finally like started helping break down this protective wall I'd built up and telling me the truth in a loving way. But she would try to tell me the truth and I would just go fisticuffs with her. I'd be so upset about it. And finally, I started kind of letting her in and letting her tell the truth. And then eventually I got to that place where I'm like, okay, this is the truth. Maybe I can start sharing it myself. But I needed to see it firsthand because I purposely put that toxicology report, that envelope in the floorboard, because I knew that if I saw on paper as fact that my parents died of fentanyl overdoses, that I would now have to acknowledge it as truth. And that I couldn't run with my prefabricated story and that sugar-coated story that I'd ran with for so many years. I remember sitting on the couch at the Foundry in Bessemer, Alabama. And the Foundry is a place where, men and women are, when they're obviously struggling with addiction and need help. It's kind of it's a great resource for men and women where they go to get the help they need. And they go through this year-long treatment program. And I remember sitting on the couch there specifically because I had started doing some work with them and started opening up and had been doing some mentoring. And I'm like, I need to face this. And so I'd already started acknowledging the truth, but I didn't know the depths of it. And I'll be honest with you, what I can remember about that day, I opened it up and, I didn't know what was in there. I've never read a toxicology report. So there were a lot of fears because I didn't know visually what it was going to look like. I didn't know if there was going to be photos. I didn't know if there was going to be diagrams. I didn't know what I was physically going to see in those reports. So it terrified me. And there were diagrams that kind of pinpointed like areas, through the investigation. And, my dad specifically had collapsed in the kitchen after having overdosed on the fentanyl. And, that was kind of mentioned there, and like lacerations and this and that. And, it was a peek into sort of the final moments of their life that were difficult. But it's crazy because I feel like at the time it was a lot to consume. But then as I continued to grow, it's really wild to me because really the information in there didn't tell us very much at all. And so now I'm looking back, and at the time it was like scary. I opened this envelope. It was a lot to consume. I mean, it was just like, oh. And then looking back on it now, I'm like, there's not much there, because it's basically 3 paragraphs that are telling you how these 2 people died in a matter of 5 hours from each other. Like there's nothing of substance in there that explains the why. And it almost makes you angry, because you're just like, okay, how did we get here? And really all we have is the typed up report of when my dad called 911 and explained what had happened to my mom. And then when they had arrived, when my dad collapsed later in the morning, and what was in there from that. And that's it. I think that was probably the hardest part, not knowing. I think, though, that at the time, that amount of information was enough for me to at least start to continue that healing process that I really needed throughout all of this.
So it gets built up as this like big, pretty scary thing. You finally open it. It is scary, but there's not that much. And then it just leaves you with so many more questions, it sounds like, too.
Yes. Sometimes more questions. And you're just like, how did we get here? So here we are, trying to continue uncovering that. But I will say that it's just been so cool, because now in getting to write this book, I've been able to just uncover all this stuff. And I'm a reporter for a living. So like I dig under the surface. I ask a lot of questions. And, I think for so many years, I ran from those same questions for myself. I just, didn't really want to dig under the surface, didn't want to peel the layers back. So it's been such a beautiful process of like getting this book out there and spending 2.5 years just like uncovering all the things that we just really as a family had no idea about.
Yeah, the middle of your book, Shatterproof, really kind of reads like a case file, like a.
I've been told that yeah, it's like this weird, like all of a sudden you get into like a John Grisham novel, like out of nowhere.
So I'm curious, how did you gather so many details about the night that your parents died? And then, how did you get to all of that information?
Yeah. So I'll say this. I think first and foremost, I got to give a shout out to my co-writer, Holland Webb. Because, it's interesting. I'm a conversationalist. So, right, like I've never written a book. I've never written a novel. I don't know how to write in that type of form. But it was so cool getting to work with him, because really what the process looked like was like we sat down and he basically interviewed me for hours upon hours upon hours. And so I'm getting these stories out on paper, but in a verbal context. And then we're taking the transcripts from that and putting it down on paper and typing it out and getting it sort of, worked up. And I think the beauty and all that, and it really was something that it didn't hit me until like just most recently. I know my story better than anybody, but here's the thing. I wasn't even asking myself some of these questions. I had never dug this deep. And so to have someone else dig as deep as they could to investigate my story, it was like a big, like full circle moment. And I think those conversations were just so powerful. And then I think the crazy thing is how everything came full circle is, it's the bookends to my book is when I met the deputy that actually responded to the call the day that my parents died. And I met him in a roundabout way, went and spoke at my high school. His son was at the school. His son went home and told dad this ESPN reporter was there. That's when it all came flooding back to Deputy Thwaites, was that, oh my gosh, like I remember that day. I remember that call. I remember showing up on the scene and being a part of that. That connection there was what led me to be able to ask more questions and to understand what visually was happening in the house. What was he seeing? What was happening? How did this all transpire? That then led me to the girl that was part of the rescue squad that went up there and did chest compressions on my mom for an hour and a half. Like these were all pieces of the story that you mentioned. It reads, like a case file. And a lot of that is because of the people that I met, even in the process of actually starting to write the book. So we were already like chapters into this thing. We were already digging into it. And all of a sudden we get this new information. And it's like, oh, and then you go back to these chapters and these areas and you're like, we got to fill this in. Because again, you take 3 paragraphs on a toxicology report and that's all you have to go off of. The fact that we have 230 pages worth of material here that like, or, 218, I guess is the book. I don't even know, to be able to figure out a lot of these details and these things that, that I do think are very important to share the story and the depths of the story, because it is so deep and it is so convoluted. And if you're not investigating and peeling back those layers, you're just kind of glossing over things. And I think I glossed over things my entire life. And especially in the back half of sort of this journey with my mom and dad, I was tired of glossing over it. So it was just in many ways exonerating to like dig into those layers and say, hey, this is my story. This is their story. This is every bit of detail that we can give you to help give you some insight into how and why we ended up where we're at now.
You mentioned running was one of your kind of main ways of dealing with grief after your parents died when you were 18. What else did you do with your grief?
Well, definitely, yeah, I definitely ran. I mentioned that there was a major struggle when I got back to Rutgers. I was failing out of school. I was just, I think there were things that I did. I was acting out in many ways, not staying focused. I was always such a focused, intentional person, like school, grades, athletics. Like that's how gymnastics is. Like I was just so regimented. And it's like everything was just absolute chaos. I'm failing out of school, can't keep the grades up. I'm injured. I'm not competing. I'm becoming so unhealthy. One thing I will tell you though that I still stick to this day, that I am very proud of, but, I made a choice when I was 15 not to drink or do drugs. It was something I made that choice even long before I knew my dad was an alcoholic and had issues there. And then, of course, long before not long before, because we were kind of entering into that phase when I was 15 with my parents and their addiction, but I didn't know about it. Right. So, I made this choice. I wasn't going to drink or do drugs. It was just something I wasn't interested in. I didn't have, any interest in altering sort of my mindset and sort of where I was heading. And even though I was exposed to it, I was around it, like kids were doing it in school. It just was something of not interest to me. And I will say that even after my parents died and I went back to Rutgers, and let's be real, it's a party scene. You go to school, frat parties. I mean, I love going to frat parties because they always had these awesome DJs up there. I love to dance, whatever, love the music. But I stayed so far away from that stuff. Like I never even drink a drop of alcohol. Like did not care, did not want it, did not want to consume it. And I look back on that and think, there was a major intersection that I could have made that choice to kind of drown my emotions, drown my sorrows, flip that switch on that grief and try to use something, a substance to cope. And I'm just so glad that I didn't, because who knows where I would have ended up today if I had made that choice to go down that pathway. But I do think that a lot of the grief and the coping, a lot of it was just escaping reality, calling my parents on the phone as if they were still living, pretending to have these conversations with them, pretending they were still there, laying in bed and just envisioning the what ifs and envisioning life and the life that I could have with them. Then you would wake up and it would just be just as much, if not more painful, because you've created this alternative reality in your head that isn't reality at all. It was this pain just kept circulating, and this want to, and this constant just grabbing for this thing that I wanted from my parents, which was just their love and their support and their presence in my life, because I was so accustomed to it. So that was very hard. But I will say this, I think when I started to open up a little bit more when I was at school, not about what had happened, but also about understanding and seeing that my life was spiraling out of control. I started actually putting in more work on myself and getting healthy again, eating better, getting, my nutrition back in check, and then going to see a therapist, like someone that I could talk to about this. And I think that was a big part of like a big step for me, because for a while there, it was like, I don't need your help. I don't need anybody. I'm fine, and then realize like, hey, you don't have to do this alone. Like you don't have to do it alone.
Seems like throughout this experience, there's the theme of opening up, and that being the door opening up to some healing for you.
Yeah. And the thing is, and I've learned this in this process, and even in writing this book, grief is not linear. Healing is not linear. And so there are going to be times where you feel like, oh man, I've arrived. Like I have found my healing and I am just, but then you take many steps backwards. And so it's just this like long winding path. And I think we're always healing. We're always healing. We're always growing. And there's never like a stopping point where you just say, man, I am at the top of this mountain and I am here. But I think there's also beauty in that, because there is that growth and that constant growth that I think really just can create more meaning in your life and more purpose. And then also give you the opportunity to help others, because grief and shame are two universal things. Everyone experiences loss and grief, and everyone experiences shame. And I think when you can use your experiences to kind of uplift other people, help them to find hope, and help them to know that better days are on the way, it really can be a beautiful thing. So I am grateful for that perspective and that lens.
One of the things that is really common for folks who are grieving is hitting milestones in life, and that being like a resurgence of the grief. Like, here's another big thing I've just gone through without my person, without my people. And there's the stereotypical ones of like graduating from college or getting married, having your son. I'm curious, with the end of your gymnastics career, which I think ended when you graduated from Rutgers, since gymnastics was such a big part of your relationship with your parents, what it was like to leave the sport.
Oh, going back to that moment, because I will say that my parents did come to Rutgers in February and they passed away in March. So that was the last time I saw them, and they actually saw me compete. I was not in the lineups yet. I was a freshman, still trying to figure it out. But my coaches had allowed me to do an exhibition routine, which essentially doesn't count towards anything, but essentially it counts as a score. Seeing my parents in that moment so proud, like I had done it. I'd worked so hard for this scholarship, and we as a family had worked so hard for it. So it was really amazing that I had that opportunity to show them sort of what I had been working on, and that, I was making progress, and that I was working towards, day by day getting better and better. But yeah, then the career ends. And I will say this, like it took me several years to actually break into the lineup, so things were obviously very challenging. Freshman year, I just wasn't there on my own. Sophomore year, I faced a lot of setbacks. Obviously, was just dealing with the trauma and the sadness and the grief and all the things. And junior year, it was just a rebuilding, just trying to get back on my feet, right? So then senior year, I finally get to this place where I'm consistent, and I'm making the lineups, and I'm on to events, and I'm competing for our team on bars and floor. And then we go to a national competition, and I remember that competition being such a disappointment, because we ended up not competing and performing our best. And it was just, a lot of little mistakes here and there cumulatively as a team. But I remember that last bar routine that I did. And I think the hardest thing about that is that I think we all thought that we had a shot at one more routine, one more opportunity, because the goal was to obviously score, be a top whatever team that would advance to the finals. And we didn't make it. And we just kind of fell apart. And I think that in many ways, I look back at that moment, I just remember being so devastated, because that's when I've had to face the truth. This is my last game. This is my last competition. This is the last time that I will ever salute a judge. And I didn't even really get to fully process that until after the last routine had been completed. And it is crazy, because you think about that, like your entire career. I competed in gymnastics for like 18 years. You think about that, and it's just like everything, things come to an end, but you oftentimes like to at least prepare for it. And I think in many ways, like you do grieve. You grieve that chapter of your life. And so, yeah, digging into that moment, like thinking back on that, of course, now being 40 years old, I'm just like, oh, I can't even imagine my body going through that ever again. I'm just like, I can leave that at the front door, but I do miss it. And when I cover mostly college football for ESPN, but I have covered some gymnastics as well. And when I see these girls out here competing, I'm always like, like you do get this little bit of, because I always joke about this, but it's true. Like there's no such thing as a pickup game of gymnastics. Like you don't just go in the backyard and play basketball, like, or flag football. It's one of those things that you don't ever get to go back out there and do it. And like I said, my body wouldn't want me to anyways. But yeah, I mean, it's definitely a wild feeling, because I do think that's part of life though. And it's, I think that's one thing that people maybe don't realize, is that in life you are going to grieve loss, but that loss isn't even necessarily a human being. It's a chapter of your life that you'll never get back. And it's so hard to see it when you're in it and you're walking in it. It's hard sometimes to cherish those moments wholeheartedly. And then you're like, wait a sec, like I've been doing this my whole life and this is about to be done. And I'm sure it's the same thing living in the world of the workforce, right? You go to work, you cash the paychecks, and there's days where you're just like, I can't wait till the day I'm not working anymore. And then that day's going to come where you're like putting in your retirement notice and like, that's it. So, and I think about that even with like ESPN. There will be a day where it is my last football game that I will go out there and cover.
Well, and on the other end of that, right, there's like the end of the chapters of your life, and then there's the start of chapters of your life. And you started your chapter of your sports journalism career without your parents. And it also sounds like it wasn't something that was on the radar while they were alive. And so you've taken your life in a direction that they didn't have any awareness of or involvement in. And I wondered what that was like for you to like start something so different.
Yeah, that's really cool because I will say, the childhood dream of being a sports doctor was so prevalent and they were aware of that and they knew like getting the scholarship was sort of the ticket to helping pay for, the beginning of that, academic foundation that would build up to that. And it's interesting because in some ways, when I had to call my Uncle Mike, who was an ER doctor, and tell him and my Auntie Linda that I didn't want to do medicine, that I didn't want to do pre-med, that I was going to change courses. Jana, I was terrified. I was so afraid. And I think a lot of that probably was because of the disappointment and maybe the inherent disappointment that I feel like in the back of my mind that if I was calling my parents up to tell them I wasn't going to do it, in some ways that I was grieving that because I think we go through life with this picture of what we're going to do and where we're going to go. And then sometimes things go in a different direction and you literally have to wave the white flag and say, hey, I'm done. And it's not necessarily surrendering, but it's surrendering to the idea that this isn't for me. Now I'm going to go. You have to give it all up and just say, I'm going to go in a different direction. And it's a scary place to be. I just remember that conversation with my uncle and being so afraid. I was going to tell them at the holidays when I went home for Christmas. And then I just like didn't because I was, So then I get back to school and I remember that conversation and where I was sitting in the kitchen of my, my friend when we were rooming there and during winter break, that conversation. And I remember just this weight being lifted off my shoulders. And his response was just like, oh, that sounds great. And he's the mathematician. He's the financial guy. He's the one that he's very calculated in everything he does. And he pretty much was just like, yeah, it was probably going to be pretty hard for you to get your GPA back up and for you to be able to even graduate and get a degree in this. So I think this is probably a smart choice. And I was like, all right, here we go, So it's just like I had this build up to that. But you're so right, because I do think that with one chapter, you put a close to it, but then that opens the door for the next one and what's on the other side of that. And I've even felt that in motherhood with my son, like, almost grieving the idea that like he's no longer using a bottle. But like on the other side of that is this little boy that's got this little personality. And for so many months, he just sort of laid there and like, you loved him, but like he didn't really respond. He didn't really like react other than like, I'm just going to cry and poop in my diaper and that's it. And then all of a sudden you're like, oh, this is like a little human being. And he starts saying things and cooing and and giving hugs. And you think, okay, you grieve that last chapter, but then there's so many other things on the other side of it. And so I think it's just being open to the idea that things are going to come to an end, but that doesn't mean your story's over. On the other side of that is something beautiful and something that you can really lean into and enjoy.
I have a couple more questions for you, and we're going to pivot because I was just recognizing you'd mentioned that when your parents died, it was 2003. It was kind of just the beginning of the pain management prescription of opioids that has, turned into so much more. And then it has shifted again, but it's in the news a lot. Like opioids are in the news, addiction, substance use, fentanyl is in the news. And I'm curious what it's like for you every time you see one of those headlines or you hear someone make a casual kind of offhanded comment about it. Like, how does that impact you?
Ooh, the offhanded comments get me real bad. Because it's a lot of times it is offhanded when they're like, oh, just give me give me a couple pills and I'll be fine. Or when people get surgery, hey, if you got any leftover, send them my way. And I'm always just like, ugh. And even on the sidelines, I see athletes when they get injured and they're in pain, like popping pills. And I'm just like, and of course I don't know what the type of pills they are and if they're, strong. I don't know the nature of them in every instance, but I will say it does trigger me because I'm like, what's the long-term effect of this? And I do think sometimes as a society, people just kind of throw it around like, oh, give me what you got. Like, let me get a little buzz off of this. And then the thing is, people don't realize the consequences of that and how that language can be pretty jarring. And for me, that language just singes my inner being. I'm like, and I think a lot of that just comes from my experiences and knowing now how something so innocent or something seemingly so by the book, you're prescribed this, can turn into something so fatal and so quick. And it was just a battle. I mean, my parents were just fighting for their lives. And I think that's the hard part because it does just trigger these thoughts sometimes. And it's like, I just want to like tell people, without offending them, because, in some ways, like I've gotten to where like I don't get offended by it anymore. It definitely sends a little tinge through me, but I'm just kind of like, all right, moving on. But then part of me is like, I could say something, but if I say something, then it embarrasses them and it makes them feel lesser than. So it's always trying to figure out the communication piece of it. And how do you have that conversation with someone and do it in a way that you kind of just say, hey, like, we shouldn't be throwing this around like it's okay, because it's not.
Yeah, that there's so much more under the surface of that specific to your story, but specific to thousands of other people's stories too. And that's been such a big part of your process, is using your story of your parents' death and their addiction to help others. It seems like that's been such a big part of your process. And wondering if there's like a story that comes to mind now of someone that you've connected with by being so open about your experience.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many stories that go along with this, many that have been so just heartwarming. And I will tell this story. It is in my book, and I want to share this specifically. And we did not use his name. We did change his name just for the sake of anonymity. But I had actually gone to this restaurant when I was here in Birmingham with my aunt and uncle for dinner. And he was a big sports fan. And it was interesting because when I showed up, he recognized me from local TV and he was like, well, why are you here? Aren't you supposed to be at the national championship covering Alabama? And, of course I was like, yeah, like, I drew the short straw, I'm the rookie. I get to have to sit at home now. And it was just one of those things where I, just kind of shook it off. And we had a conversation and, he's a great waiter, didn't think anything of it, ended up getting up and going to the bathroom. And while I was in the bathroom, my auntie had said to him, and they got to talking a little bit, and she said, yeah, she's got a story. And I didn't know this conversation was ever had. So I come back to the table, we pay our bill, we leave, think nothing of it. Well, a few years goes by, and a friend of mine who worked for the Addiction Prevention Coalition, Danny at the time, said, hey, this guy came here, showed up wanting to volunteer. And he said he knew you, and you're a big reason why he's here. And then he said, like, oh, yeah, he had seen you posting some stuff about on social media. Well, then I eventually, once he starts volunteering, get in touch with him. And I'm just like, okay, I need to know more about this. Like, where did we first meet? Like, how did this all come about? He said, well, it was the time that you came into the restaurant and I waited on you. Your auntie told me you had a story. I went home and I Google searched and I saw a couple things here and there about your family and about your situation. And I was just like, it brought me to tears. He told me then that he had also struggled with addiction and was something he was so ashamed of for so many years that he never spoke up about it, never shared anything about it, was so afraid. The only people that knew about his addiction were really just his like parents, his close family, and then his wife. And he was just so ashamed of it and didn't want people to know. And that after he had learned a little bit about my story, learned more about me outside of just being a sports reporter, he had this courage to actually share with his next door neighbor that he had gone through this and that he had experienced addiction firsthand and that it had ravaged his life and things had really been challenging for him. And he, finally was able to pick up the pieces and move forward. knowing my story and seeing me start to share my story was just that little bit of hope, maybe that little bit of nudge that gave him permission to share his story and gave him the courage to say, you know what, I'm going to share this. And it was just that little bit of vulnerability that then allowed him down the road to come and volunteer and to be open and to share his story and to impact people and to be involved in recovery programs. And it just completely transitioned his entire life and his trajectory. You know, what a beautiful way to help somebody. And it all just comes down to like one note, one nugget, one something that my aunt said to him that compelled him to go dig a little bit more, that then just the ripple effect of that. And I think that's just what's so beautiful about it, is you don't know who's listening. You don't know who's paying attention. You know, when you walk through life, I think it's so important to be vulnerable, to be open, and to know that whether it's today, tomorrow, or years from now, your story and your vulnerability and your courage might be something that impacts someone else's lives, and you may never even know. But maybe it comes back full circle and you recognize how you were able to do something to impact someone else's life. And now the trajectory of their life is completely going in a different direction just because of your little bit of courage that you shared with them and little bit of hope that you shared with them in this process.
So, Lauren, as we come to the end of our conversation today, you mentioned it's going to be 22 years this spring since your parents died. What's one way that you continue to stay connected to them?
I think obviously sharing their story is how I stay connected. But one thing that I love to do, and this has kind of just become a tradition for me. So when I was in gymnastics, I used to always, like during the national anthem, it was my time that, you know, I would just kind of like bring myself, you know, because the nerves and the adrenaline and everything's happening. And so the national anthem's playing, and it's the one moment where like you're not gripping up, you're not focused on the gymnastics, like you're settling in, and you know the gymnastics competition is about to start. And it was when I would you know, just kind of like say my prayers and just sort of like settle in, take a deep breath, and like bring myself into the moment. Little did I know back then it was actually like a grounding exercise. Had no idea. Now that I've learned that this is like actually a thing. When I step foot on the football field, that is my moment. It's the moment that I, as a woman of faith, do talk to God, whatever that is for different people. But I also talk to my parents. I kind of give it up to them and just like, thank you for being here. Thank you for this opportunity to share stories, to have an impact. And it's like I really feel their presence in that moment. It's just like that moment where I'm grounded in it. You know, you get 45 seconds or a minute to just be. It's almost like all the extraneous noise, everything on the outside, and you're just in this moment. I just love that opportunity to talk to them and just to kind of pray, you know, really just praise them for being where I am and knowing that they're along with me on this journey.
So everyone you interview is actually being interviewed in a way by three people: your mom, your dad, and you.
Yeah. Yes. I love that. Absolutely. Because it's that little extra bit of heart, that care, that compassion that I feel like comes from my experiences with my mom and dad and what they've been through. And I think that's so powerful. So yeah, in a way it is. I love that. That's so cool.
Well, Lauren, as we wrap up our time for this episode, how can listeners get connected with you, with your book, Shatterproof, that's just out now? Like, where should people go to find you?
Yeah. So website, laurensisler.com. If you want to reach out to me, shoot me an email. There's a contact form on there that you can actually reach out. I get them personally, so I will see it come through, and I would love to hear from you, hear your story, hear what connected you, what resonates with you. So shoot me a note there. I'm also on social media at Lauren Sisler on all the channels. DMs are open, so feel free to pop me a note there. Would love to hear from you. And then if you're interested in the book Shatterproof, I would love for you to get your hands on it. It's pretty much anywhere you can get your books online, whether it's Amazon, there's an ebook, there's a hardcover, and there's also an audio that I tracked myself, or narrated myself. So if you're interested in hearing the narrated version, that's there for you. Yeah, you can go to barnesandnoble.com, bookshop. There's all, you know, you can pretty much find it anywhere online. Just Google search Lauren Sisler Shatterproof. I just love the support. I appreciate the support and the work that you all do in helping people that are going through this significant grief and loss and the fears that come with what's next. And I think that having your allies and that you're the people that can help pick you up because you can't do it alone. And I just want to say thank you for the great work that you guys are doing too, Jana.
Well, Lauren, thank you so much again for making time during a very busy football season to be part of Grief Out Loud, for sharing your story with me, with our listeners, and for your book that's out in the world right now.
Thank you.
And listeners, you know, I say this each and every time, but thank you for being part of the show, for tuning in, for sharing episodes with people that you think might be helped by what we're talking about here. If you want to reach out to me, you can email me at griefoutloud@dougie.org. The dougy.org is our main website, where you can find information about local programming, all of our downloadable activities and tip sheets, and each and every episode of Grief Out Loud. The podcast is sponsored in part by the Chester Stephan Endowment Fund, and Grief Out Loud is produced by Dougie Center here in Portland, Oregon. Thanks again for listening. We hope you'll join us again next time.